Imagine this. You're standing in your kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at your phone, crafting yet another text message, your fingers dancing across the screen as you carefully construct sentences designed to justify why you left the party early, why you seemed distant during dinner, why you didn't laugh at that joke everyone found hilarious. You delete, you retype, you delete again. The words feel hollow, but the compulsion remains this desperate need to make them understand, to make them see that you're not difficult, not antisocial, not broken. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally shatter everything you thought you knew about human connection and self-worth. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why the very behavior you believe makes you a good person is actually the silent assassin of your authentic self. This isn't just another self-help concept. This is a psychological revolution that will change how you move through the world forever. But here's the thing. Most people will watch this, nod along, and then go right back to explaining themselves into oblivion. Don't be most people. If you're ready to break free from the invisible chains of compulsive self-justification, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button if you've ever felt trapped by your own need to be understood. And when this video inevitably triggers something deep within you, and it will drop a comment below and tell me which explanation you're finally ready to stop giving. Trust me, you'll know exactly what it is by the end. Now imagine something far more disturbing. What if this midnight ritual of self-explanation isn't just about a single text message? What if it's the invisible architecture of your entire existence? Here's the paradox that will shake you to your core. The very act that you believe keeps you connected to others is the exact mechanism that's severing you from yourself. Every explanation you offer, every justification you craft, every elaborate defense of your emotions and choices is not bringing you closer to human understanding. It's pushing you further into a psychological prison where your warden is your own desperate need for approval. Carl Jung, the pioneering depth psychologist whose insights into the human psyche remain unparalleled, identified this pattern as one of the most insidious forms of self-abandonment plaguing modern consciousness. According to Jung's analysis, as detailed in psychological frameworks examining compulsive self-explanation, when you constantly explain yourself, you're not being considerate. You're unconsciously declaring that your inner reality only becomes valid when filtered through someone else's understanding. But here's what's truly unsettling. You've been conditioned to see this self-betrayal as virtue. Society applauds those who can articulate their feelings, who can provide rational explanations for their behavior, who can smooth over conflicts with carefully chosen words. You've been trained to believe that the person who can explain themselves eloquently is emotionally intelligent, socially aware, psychologically mature. What if the opposite is true? What if the most psychologically free individuals are those who have learned the radical art of not explaining themselves at all? Consider this terrifying possibility. Every time you feel compelled to justify your sadness, rationalize your boundaries, or explain why certain people drain your energy, you're not demonstrating emotional maturity. You're revealing a deep wound, a wound that whispers. Your experience isn't real until someone else validates it. Your feelings aren't legitimate until they make sense to others. Your existence isn't justified until you can prove it belongs. Jung understood that this compulsion emerges from what he termed emotional invalidation. Those crucial developmental moments when your authentic self-expression was met with dismissal, criticism, or the devastating phrase, "You're being too sensitive." The child who hears "stop being dramatic" when they express pain learns a dangerous lesson. Authenticity is punishable, but performance might earn love. And so begins a lifelong pattern of psychological submission disguised as social grace. But here's the question that should terrify and liberate you simultaneously. What would happen if you simply stopped? What if you refused to explain why you need space after social gatherings? What if you didn't justify your career choices to relatives who question your path? What if you allowed your no to be complete, without the trailing paragraph of reasons and apologies? The answer Jung discovered will fundamentally alter your understanding of power, relationships, and the very nature of psychological freedom. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you don't just change your communication patterns, you dismantle an entire system of internal oppression that has been quietly ruling your life. The people around you will notice something different, something they can't quite name. Your presence will carry a new weight, a quiet authority that doesn't demand attention but somehow commands respect. The manipulators in your life will find themselves suddenly powerless, their emotional tactics bouncing off a wall they never knew existed. But the most profound transformation won't be in how others treat you. It will be in how you begin to treat yourself. Because the moment you stop outsourcing your self-worth to external understanding, you're forced to confront the most important question you've been avoiding your entire life. Who are you when no one is watching? And more importantly, who are you when no one understands? The answer to that question holds the key to everything that follows. Here's the brutal truth that Jung discovered through decades of analyzing the human psyche. Your compulsive need to explain yourself isn't a personality quirk. It's a survival mechanism born from a specific type of psychological trauma. Not the dramatic, obvious kind that makes headlines, but the insidious, everyday invalidation that happens in seemingly normal families, schools, and social environments. Picture a child who comes home excited about a drawing they made, only to hear, "That's nice, dear, but shouldn't you be doing your homework instead?" Or imagine a young person expressing genuine fear about something, only to be met with, "There's nothing to be afraid of. You're being silly." These moments seem insignificant, barely worth remembering. But Jung understood that these micro-invalidations accumulate like psychological sediment, eventually forming the bedrock of adult neuroses. What happens in these crucial developmental moments is the creation of what Jung termed the false self, a carefully constructed persona designed to earn approval rather than express authenticity. The child learns a devastating lesson. My inner experience is wrong, inappropriate, or somehow deficient. I must translate my feelings into something more acceptable before I can share them with the world. This is where the philosophical weight of the problem becomes staggering. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about the danger of becoming human, all too human, losing our individual essence in the desperate attempt to fit societal molds. Your constant explanations aren't just communication. They're acts of self-erasure, tiny daily betrayals of your authentic self in service of an impossible goal, making everyone understand and approve of your existence. Jung's contemporary, the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, would have recognized this pattern immediately. He wrote about bad faith, the human tendency to deny our fundamental freedom by pretending we have no choice but to conform to others' expectations. Every time you feel compelled to explain why you need alone time, why you don't drink alcohol, or why certain conversations make you uncomfortable, you're engaging in bad faith. You're pretending that your inner experience needs external validation to be legitimate. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly revolutionary. This behavior isn't just psychologically damaging, it's philosophically absurd. You're essentially asking others to give you permission to experience your own life. You're outsourcing your right to exist authentically to people who will never have access to your inner world, no matter how eloquently you describe it. The tragedy deepens when you realize that this pattern becomes self-perpetuating. The more you explain yourself, the more you reinforce the belief that your experience requires justification. You train both yourself and others to expect elaborate explanations for your perfectly normal human responses to life. You become trapped in what Jung called the pleasing prison, a psychological cage where the bars are made of other people's potential disapproval. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, understood this dynamic centuries before Jung formalized it. He observed that most human suffering comes from our desperate attachment to how others perceive us. Your explanations aren't really about communication, they're about control. You're trying to control others' thoughts about you, their reactions to you, their judgments about your choices. But this is a fool's errand, because other people's minds are not your territory. The most disturbing aspect of this psychological trap is how it masquerades as virtue. Society celebrates the emotionally articulate person, the one who can explain their feelings, justify their boundaries, rationalize their decisions. But Jung saw through this cultural deception. He recognized that true emotional maturity isn't about explaining yourself better, it's about needing to explain yourself less. This realization leads us to an uncomfortable question. If your constant explanations aren't actually improving your relationships or increasing understanding, what are they really accomplishing? The answer will disturb you more than you expect. What your explanations are really accomplishing is something far more sinister than failed communication. They're systematically dismantling your psychological sovereignty. Every time you justify your emotions, rationalize your boundaries, or explain your choices, you're not just sharing information, You're participating in your own psychological colonization. Here's the terrifying mechanism Jung identified. Each explanation you offer reinforces a neural pathway that says, "My inner experience needs external approval to be valid." Your brain, that remarkable pattern recognition machine, begins to interpret every unexplained moment as a potential threat. The silence after you set a boundary becomes unbearable. The confused look when you decline an invitation triggers panic. You've trained your nervous system to equate lack of understanding with danger. This creates what cognitive scientists now recognize as approval addiction, a neurochemical dependency where your brain releases stress hormones whenever you suspect someone might not understand your behavior. You become psychologically addicted to the relief that comes from a successful explanation, the momentary calm when someone finally gets it. But like any addiction, the relief is temporary, and the underlying anxiety grows stronger. Jung observed that this pattern creates what he called psychological fragmentation. You begin to split yourself into the version that exists privately and the carefully curated version you present for approval. The gap between these two selves becomes a source of chronic internal tension. You know who you really are, but you can only show carefully edited portions to the world, portions that come with explanatory footnotes and justifications. The cultural conditioning makes this even more insidious. We live in a society that demands transparency, emotional labor, and constant availability for other people's understanding. Social media amplifies this to a pathological degree. Every post becomes an opportunity to explain yourself. Every story, a chance to justify your existence to an invisible audience of judges. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. This isn't really about other people at all. The person you're trying most desperately to convince isn't your friend, your partner, or your family. It's the internalized voice of every authority figure who ever made you feel that your natural responses were wrong, inappropriate, or insufficient. You're not explaining yourself to others, you're explaining yourself to the ghost of every person who ever invalidated your experience. You're trying to win an argument with phantoms, seeking approval from internalized critics who will never be satisfied no matter how eloquent your justifications become. This creates a feedback loop of psychological exhaustion. The more you explain, the more you reinforce the belief that explanations are necessary. The more explanations you give, the more people expect them. You become trapped in a performance of perpetual justification, where your authentic self suffocates under layers of rationalization and people-pleasing. The most devastating consequence? You begin to lose touch with your own inner compass. When you constantly translate your feelings into explanations that others will find acceptable, you stop trusting your immediate emotional responses. You second-guess your instincts, doubt your perceptions, and question your right to feel what you feel without having a good reason for it. Jung called this the death of internal authority, the moment when your own experience becomes less real to you than other people's opinions about your experience. You become a stranger to yourself, living according to an elaborate system of external validation rather than internal truth. But what Jung discovered next changed everything. There's a way out of this prison, and it's more radical than you can imagine. The rebellion begins with a single, terrifying act: silence. Not the passive silence of someone who has given up, but the active silence of someone who has finally realized they owe no one an explanation for their existence. Jung called this the first step toward individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others expect you to be. But this isn't about becoming rude or dismissive. This is about something far more revolutionary, developing what Jung termed internal authority, the unshakable conviction that your experience is valid simply because it's yours. No committee vote required. No external validation needed. Your emotions don't need to make sense to others. Your boundaries don't require justification. Your choices don't need approval. The radical shift happens when you replace the question, "Will they understand?" with, "Does this align with my truth?" You stop asking for permission to exist and start claiming your right to be. This single mindset change dismantles decades of conditioning in an instant. Here's how the rebellion unfolds in practice. When someone asks why you left the party early, instead of launching into an elaborate explanation about social energy and introversion, you simply say, "I was ready to leave." When pressed for more details, you don't provide them. When someone seems confused by your boundary, you resist the compulsion to make it comfortable for them. You let confusion exist without rushing to resolve it. This feels impossibly difficult at first because you're going against everything you've been taught about social grace and consideration. But Jung understood that true consideration isn't about making everyone comfortable with your choices. It's about being authentic enough that people can have genuine relationships with the real you, not your carefully edited explanation of yourself. The most powerful historical examples of this principle come from individuals who changed the world not by explaining themselves better, but by refusing to explain themselves at all. Gandhi didn't justify his methods to the British Empire, he simply acted according to his inner compass. Rosa Parks didn't provide elaborate explanations for why she wouldn't give up her seat. She trusted that her truth was enough. These weren't acts of stubbornness, they were acts of supreme internal authority. You begin to realize that the people who demand explanations for your perfectly reasonable human responses often aren't seeking understanding, they're seeking control. They want to debate your boundaries, negotiate your emotions, and convince you that your inner experience is somehow wrong or insufficient. The moment you stop participating in these negotiations, their power over you evaporates. Jung observed that this transition requires what he called comfortable solitude, the ability to be alone with yourself without the constant chatter of self-justification. You must learn to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood without immediately rushing to correct the misunderstanding. You must develop tolerance for other people's confusion about your choices without taking responsibility for resolving that confusion. The most counterintuitive discovery in this process is that when you stop trying to be understood, you often become more deeply understood than ever before. When your words come from internal certainty rather than external approval seeking, they carry a different weight. People listen differently to someone who isn't begging to be heard. But the ultimate rebellion isn't against others. It's against the internalized voice that insists you need permission to be human. Every time you resist the compulsion to explain, you're declaring independence from psychological colonization. You're reclaiming your right to experience your own life without translation, justification, or apology. And that's when the most profound transformation begins, one that reaches into the very core of how you understand reality itself. Here's the ultimate truth that Jung discovered, the revelation that changes everything. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't just change how others see you, you fundamentally alter the fabric of reality around you. This isn't metaphysical mysticism. This is psychological physics. Your refusal to justify your existence creates a gravitational pull that reorganizes every relationship, every interaction, every dynamic in your life. The moment you embody true internal authority, something extraordinary happens. People begin to treat you as someone who cannot be negotiated with, manipulated, or controlled, not because you're aggressive or defensive, but because you emanate the quiet certainty of someone who has made peace with being misunderstood. This energy is so rare in our explanation-obsessed culture that it stands out like a beacon. Jung understood that this transformation operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there's the immediate social shift. Manipulative people simply lose interest in you because you're no longer playing their game. Emotional vampires find no sustenance because you're not offering your energy for their approval. Toxic relationships naturally dissolve because they require your participation in the drama of constant justification to survive. But the deeper transformation happens within your own psyche. When you stop betraying yourself through compulsive explanations, you begin to experience what Jung called psychological integration, the reunification of your authentic self with your expressed self. The exhausting gap between who you are and who you pretend to be finally closes. You stop living as a divided being, and this integration creates an almost magnetic presence that others can feel but can't quite name. This is where Jung's insight becomes truly revolutionary. Your silence becomes more powerful than any words you could ever speak. It's not empty silence, it's full silence, pregnant with self-knowledge and unshakable internal authority. When someone asks why you made a particular choice, and you simply say, "Because it felt right," without elaboration, you're not being dismissive. You're demonstrating something most people have never witnessed: complete trust in your own inner compass. The world responds to this energy in ways that will astound you. Opportunities that once required elaborate self-advocacy simply present themselves. Respect that you used to beg for through explanations is freely given. Boundaries that you once had to defend with lengthy justifications are automatically honored. It's as if the universe recognizes and rewards authenticity in ways that performance and people-pleasing never could access. But here's the most profound realization of all. You discover that you were never really trying to explain yourself to others. You were trying to explain yourself to yourself. Every justification you offered to the world was actually an attempt to convince the scared, invalidated child within you that you had permission to exist as you are. When you stop seeking that permission externally, something miraculous happens. You finally give it to yourself. Jung called this the ultimate act of self-love, refusing to negotiate your own worth. When you embody this truth, you become living proof that it's possible to exist without apology, to feel without justification, to choose without consensus. You become a walking demonstration that authentic human beings don't require universal understanding to thrive. The ripple effects extend far beyond your personal life. You begin to attract people who relate to your authenticity rather than your explanations. Conversations become more genuine because they're not filtered through the desperate need to be understood. Your creative expression becomes more powerful because it's not diluted by the fear of judgment. Your decision-making becomes clearer because it's not clouded by the anxiety of potential disapproval. This is Jung's ultimate gift to humanity. The recognition that your deepest psychological healing doesn't come from being better understood by others. It comes from finally understanding that you never needed their understanding in the first place. Your existence is not a thesis that requires defense. Your emotions are not theories that need proof. Your choices are not hypotheses awaiting approval. You are not a question mark seeking an answer from the world. You are a period at the end of your own sentence, complete, final, and requiring no further explanation. When you embody this truth fully, everything changes. Not because you've learned new communication skills or developed better boundaries, but because you've remembered something you always knew but had forgotten. You were born with the right to exist exactly as you are, and no amount of explanation will ever add to or subtract from that fundamental truth. The silence that once terrified you becomes your sanctuary. The misunderstandings you once scrambled to correct become irrelevant. The approval you once desperately sought becomes unnecessary. And in that space of complete self-acceptance, you finally discover who you truly are when no one is watching and no one understands, and you realize that person is more magnificent than any explained version of yourself could ever be. This is the revolution Jung offered. Not the freedom to be understood, but the freedom from needing to be understood. And once you taste that freedom, you'll never go back to the prison of compulsive explanation again. The question that remains is not whether you'll stop explaining yourself, it's whether you're ready to discover who you become when you finally do.